with local Indigenous communities, and I'm pleased to invite two good friends of mine who have been active in Alaska, both Nicole Peters and Carrlee. And I'd like to introduce them with a little bit of background. Carrlee has been the objects conservator at the Alaska State Museum since 2006. Her research interests include the relationship of Alaskans to the materials of material culture, particularly Alaska Native artists and organic materials. She graduated from the conservation program at New York University in 2000, completed a fellowship at the National Museum of the American Indian, and moved to Alaska in 2001. She was a curator of collections at the Juneau Douglas City Museum and had a private conservation practice for several years before joining the staff at the Alaska State Museum in Juneau, Alaska. She has recently completed her PhD in anthropology from the University of Alaska in Fairbanks. And someday I hope to be just like Ellen, but you should know that her favorite snack is circus peanuts. But opening the talk will be Nicole Peters, who is an objects conservator in private practice and who has worked extensively throughout the state of Alaska. She received her MA and Certificate of Advanced Study in the Conservation of Objects from Buffalo State College. She has worked with the Alaska Region National Park Service, Alaskan Native Cultural Centers, local museums, and nonprofit organizations conserving collections and performing backcountry preservation work throughout the state of Alaska. She is currently working on contract for the National Air and Space Museum and Clara Barton National Historical Park. Now, Nicole is a true delight and has an obscenely large earring collection. And with that, I will turn it over to Nicole to open up our presentation. And so we're also going to do just a quick presentation from both Ellen and Nicole, and then we're going to open up for a pretty lengthy Q&A session. And please use the chat function to ask your questions.
Nicole, you're still muted.
I think she said she can't unmute.
Oh, I will take care of that.
I'm reading lips.
Thank you. There we go. Should be able to unmute now.
Okay, yay. I was like, I can't unmute myself. Okay, I'm going to share my screen here. Okay, hello everyone. First, I would like to thank the Washington Conservation Guild for inviting me to speak on this panel today, and also to say what an honor it is to share this platform with Ellen, who has been doing conservation and preservation work in Alaska for quite some time now, and who is such an amazing asset to the Alaskan community. Like Gwen had mentioned, I'm an objects conservator in private practice who up until recently was solely based out of Alaska. I am currently speaking to you from Frederick, Maryland. And to that effect, I would like to begin by acknowledging the Piscataway people, the traditional custodians of the land from which I'm speaking to you today, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. So due to the brief presentations, both Ellen and I will be giving in this session to allow for conversation afterwards, I'm going to sort of jump right in. I was asked to briefly mention how I ended up in Alaska, and it really started in 2012 with an internship I did with the National Park Service under the mentorship of Scott Carrlee. That first experience in Alaska sort of solidified my love affair with the state and the people and obviously the culture. Fast forward to 2016 and in sort of a leap into the unknown with my partner, who I also met in Alaska. You know, I gathered my belongings and I very fortunately had a few contracts lined up and I moved to Alaska. For the next 4 years, I traveled all around the state performing preservation work for museums, historical societies, cultural and Indigenous community centers, the Park Service, and for private clients in sort of a mobile conservation lab fashion. Which the logistics for that alone, I can save for another time or for Q&A maybe. Okay, so it's sort of tricky to summarize my experiences working with Indigenous communities in any sort of a brief talk, because there's really a lot to reflect on, and so much I'm still processing from these experiences. So what I'd like to do is maybe just briefly highlight some projects where dialogue and collaboration either challenged or helped bring light to the direction of preservation, and also projects that lead to collaboration within individual communities outside of conservation altogether. So what I think, what sets the conservation of cultural material in Alaska apart from any other sort of experience I've had thus far in my career is the simultaneous sort of rich history paired with the contemporary use of these objects and the integration of them into everyday life. There's been times I've been working with collections and someone will say, oh, that was my auntie's hat, or, oh, that's actually my own parka that was made for me as a child. It sort of takes you back a bit and puts things in a bit of a different perspective about what the end goals of treatment are or should be, and what methods might be necessary to apply in order to achieve those specific goals. So for example, after having a number of conversations about repair options and the intended use and application for the spruce root hat I have pictured here, the client who I was working with said, very lovingly in a fun sort of way, I know all about these tissue paper and wheat starch, repairs you all do, and those are great. But here's the thing, I'm going to be wearing this hat for celebration and for other events in Southeast Alaska. So I need these repairs to last. I need them to go beyond just a museum object repair. And so this example is really just a glimpse into one of the first of many conversations I had where my sort of traditional tools or methods or training was maybe challenged a bit in order to stabilize an object that existed beyond sitting on a shelf or a museum mount per se. And so, another instance or a brief example is, after having discussions with community members over the years, there's some objects where I'm just not sure anymore. I don't know if it's my place to intervene. Especially if it's something like a structural fix or a missing component to something like a totem pole. My feelings about treating some objects in Alaska has changed over the years. And sometimes I'm not sure if it's work that I should be intervening with. Oh, sorry. There we go. In addition to having these conversations about an object's past, present, and future use, and how sometimes the utility of an object informs, treatment procedures, the disclosure and transparency of the treatment options or recommendations is really critical. So instead of me coming on site and saying, well, this is what I think is best, so this is what we're going to do. I don't do that anymore. I provide everyone with the different levels of intervention that we can choose from, and the pros and cons of doing something or not doing something, and also clearly describing any foreign materials that may need to be applied to the surface or structure, and the relevance of using maybe more, traditional or more natural materials and adhesives versus modern or synthetic materials. And by having these sort of open conversations and dialogue, it really it opens up the space to talk about the object itself and what features are pertinent to retain or stabilize according to use, past and present. In some cases, it's involved collaborative work with the object or on the object itself. In the lower right-hand corner is Athabascan elder Al Starr from Nanana. And he actually stuck around and helped me as I repaired his family's bear spear, which he himself said felt really good that he was able to be there and talk with me about it. It was a utilitarian object. I think he said it was recorded as being responsible for, I don't know, at least 3 brown bear kills. So, we're looking at the spear and we're talking about use and damage and from personal familial knowledge. We just had a really good time together. It was a really good experience working side by side with him. Another project I worked on with the National Park Service was removing these 3 parkas from freezer treatment from insect infestation, followed by some pretty basic just cleaning, preening, rehousing. But during the treatment, we discovered that the parkas were sewn by Rose Headland and Anisha Zekar from Lake Iliamna. And we were able to touch base with family members there. And from there, it sort of sparked a whole other project outside of conservation, in which curator Katie Myers has taken the lead to record information of the process of making a traditional Dena'ina parka, from the hunting of the squirrels to the preparation of the hides, making the patterns, sewing the parka, and then doing all of this, in conjunction with the summer youth camp in Lake Iliamna. So where, elders and, young folks and, potential skin sewers can all gather, to participate in this ongoing project, which is now a part of the program. So I guess, looking at the present and the future a little bit, and what I and several of my Alaskan colleagues hope to see really is more direct involvement and collaboration with communities when it comes to preservation. Really, it shouldn't ever be a line item that is added at the end if there's funding, if there's money. It should be first and foremost and built into projects and workflow from the beginning. And it can be done on multiple levels, just as I'm talking to you tonight on Zoom. So there's different avenues to pursue there. An example of this sort of project where all of this is sort of built in is something that I'm currently involved with. Unfortunately, it's currently in hiatus due to COVID-19. But it's a project with the Museum of the North, University of Alaska in Fairbanks. And it's an NEH funded project, and it's an Indigenous watercraft preservation project. It's a multi-year ongoing event where local Indigenous community members, representatives, boat builders, craftspeople participate to share their perspectives so that the museum can develop a project that meets the needs of Alaska's Native peoples and their goals for cultural preservation, while also fulfilling the museum's mandate to collect, preserve, make publicly available the material objects associated with the people of Alaska. The idea is to work collaboratively and combine conservation and traditional methods in a way that local Indigenous communities feel is appropriate, while also exercising conservation approaches and ethics. So, which is where I think and I hope that conservation of Indigenous materials is kind of heading in Alaska. And like I said, this is really quick. We're sort of doing like a drive-by highlights of some interactions and projects. So these are just a few of the experiences I've had working with Indigenous community members, and how, open communication and collaboration about how these items are activated within the community has informed my approach to cultural materials in general. In Alaska, as a private conservator, you are many times without the buffer of a major museum or institution, and you are traveling to people's backyards to work on extremely personal and extremely important items and relics, which demand a tremendous amount of respect and consideration to the history, the culture, and to the craft itself. So my experiences in Alaska have really instilled in me the importance of collaborative work, conversation, open dialogue, communication, all of these components whether it be for a small private treatment for somebody or a major, a major museum project. And to that effect, so that's what I have prepared. I'd like to say thank you, Gonoshish. And I'm going to turn it over. I'm going to drive for Ellen, so she's probably going to tell me to go to the next slide. But thank you for your attention. And here is Ellen, Ellen Carrlee.
Hi, thank you, Nicole, for driving for me. Could you go to the next slide? Okay, so I just want to give you a little sense of Alaska. Here it is overlaid on top of the United States. And if you cut Alaska in half, it would still be the first and second largest states, with Texas being the third largest state. And it has a population only slightly bigger than the District of Columbia. More than half of that population is in Anchorage and Fairbanks, which are about an 8 or 10 hour drive apart from each other. And aside from the towns in that area, almost none of Alaska's communities are on the road system at all, including most of the communities down in the Southeast Panhandle, where Juneau and Sitka are located. They are about a 30-minute plane ride apart. And Juneau, Alaska's capital city, is a little less than 2 hours from Anchorage by air, and a little more than a 2-hour flight to Seattle. Next slide. On the left is a photo from my walk to work a couple days ago. The Alaska State Museum is on Tlingit Ani, or Tlingit land. Downtown Juneau is the land of the Aquan Tlingit people. And the Tlingit culture has two moieties, or halves, that are in balance, the raven and the eagle. These are represented here by the Tlenedi and the Wushkitans, respectively. And then our museum in Sitka is on the land of the Shitkaquan Tlingit people, and those clans in balance are the Kiksari and the Kagwantan. The Sheldon Jackson Museum in Sitka is the oldest museum in Alaska, established in 1888. But the Tlingit people have been here for more than 10,000 years, and we are guests on their land. The two Alaska State Museums together have about 40,000 objects, and our staff right now totals 11, with a few vacancies in addition to that 11. The next slide, please. So I'm hoping my contribution to the conversation today will be to hit upon 3 main points. One, that objects are important because objects are important to people. I feel like I'm constantly reminding myself of this because my training 20 years ago emphasized my role as an advocate for the object. Number 2, I want to emphasize an approach to conservation practice that looks for networks of relationships. In this way, we're not alone in our authority to intervene in the care of material culture, but we're also not alone in our treatment dilemmas and coming up with appropriate strategies. And thirdly, I recognize that we all have limited time and resources, and I found it helpful to pick a passion or two where I try to go deep. But you just can't do that with everything. Next slide. This is a Chilkat robe, a kind of a Northwest Coast ceremonial garment I've been working with recently. We put this one on exhibit when our new building opened in 2016. There are only about a dozen living weavers who can still make one, and we brought in Tlingit weaver Anna Brown Ellers, seen on the right, to do the restorations on this robe. Anna and I co-authored an article about the process for an anthropology journal. Next slide. I've also been involved in the Chilkat Dye Working Group, which is a collaboration between our museum, a group of about 20 Chilkat weavers, and Portland State University. The chemistry lab of Tammy Lassiter-Clare started the Pacific Northwest Conservation Science Consortium to do analytical projects with several Northwest Coast institutions. Chilkat weaver Liana Wallace, in the upper right, was on our museum staff at that time and encouraged a dye analysis project. The images on the left show weavers studying robes in our collection. We've also been experimenting with natural dyes together, as shown on the lower right. Wolf moss was traditionally used for yellows and is still used today. Next slide. Here's a draft of what kind of an abbreviated network of relationships looks like for this research on Chilkat dyes and weavings. You'll see I've got conservators in blue, both colleagues and interns, cultural experts in green, and institutions in orange. The museum staff in yellow here is the curator, who's working with Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian co-curators for an exhibit this summer on Northwest Coast textile regalia. Next slide. Here's a second area of collaborative research, gut. In particular, intestine from seals, whales, and bears that was used historically to make things like waterproof raincoats, but is rarely used for anything today. I started researching this material back in 2009 when NYU conservation student Amy Chong had a materials question that I couldn't answer. She's now working at the American Museum of Natural History, and we're still both collaborating on gut. We're lucky to have processed bear gut together with Dr. Sven Hawkinson, shown on the left, an Alutiiq scholar, artist, and curator at the Burke Museum in Seattle. I also pursued fieldwork with Yupik experts. The Yupik relationships of process and gut was the topic of my PhD dissertation in anthropology. In the image in the middle there, my collaborators are teaching me about beluga whale intestine, which is also a delicacy in Yupik cuisine, shown as the Carrlee pink kyak on the black plate in the lower right picture. Next slide, please. Treatment-wise, the photo in the upper left shows a gut parka repair that was done as part of a museum conference in Cordova, Alaska. The woman in blue is Elaine Kiniguk, a St. Lawrence Island Yupik skin sewing expert who repaired the parka. In the photo, she's sharing her work with Sylvia Allen, a relative of the man who made the parka, and Leona Olson, both local Indigenous women. Elaine has also been involved in treatments and knowledge sharing with the Smithsonian's Arctic Studies Center at the Anchorage Museum. They have an excellent series called Material Traditions that you should look up on YouTube. Up in Anchorage, Monica Shaw and Sarah Owens are the only other full-time conservators working in Alaska right now, and have been very involved in that Material Traditions work. Elaine Kiniguk also repaired a parka for the National Museum of the American Indian, now on exhibit in Anchorage, and conservators at NMAI have published about that collaboration. On the right are two of my interns working on items made of gut. Hosting interns is a really important part of my conservation practice and a major way that I stay connected to the field. Next slide, please. So here's another abbreviated network of relationships for collaborative gut research, showing again conservators in blue, cultural experts in green, institutions in orange, and museum staff in yellow. Since this talk is being recorded, you can peek at this network again later. I just wanted to give you a sense of how all of this research is linked together through relationships. Next slide. And so finally, back to these three main points: that objects are important because they matter to people, that networks of relationships, or as some conservators are calling them, networks of care, broaden and diversify the voices of authority and treatment choices and support ethical conservation practice. And from these examples, I hope it illustrates how picking specific passions to pursue more deeply has opened up opportunities that have made me a better conservator. I was intentionally brief with this introduction in order to maximize our time for discussion, but I'm happy to give more detail on any of these projects either today or if people contact me later on too. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ellen and Nicole, for sharing your thoughts with us today. We already have some fantastic questions, so let's dive in. I'm just gonna scroll to the first that I see here from Sue Donovan, who has asked if there are specific techniques that you have learned, either of you, while working with community members in terms of stitching or adhesives in order to keep these materials in use by their communities.
Do you want me to, or Ellen, do you want to go first, or do you want me to go?
If you got something, jump in.
You know, I'm speaking a bit prematurely, but the whole impetus for the project that's going to be happening in Fairbanks is going to be just that. There is a large amount of watercraft in the collection that has stretch skins or birch bark, a lot of gut, and it's all, tethered around these, wooden, boat frames essentially. And that's what we're trying to figure out is how to sort of join these two worlds of conservation and also using traditional materials. In my personal, practices in Alaska, working with folks, I don't think I've gone any done anything super rogue. I've definitely repaired gut skin with gut skin instead of gold beater skin or something of the similar, just on, request and personal preference. But I haven't gotten too much into like using like pitch or rejoining, wooden components with original or other like hand carved components. But I think Ellen might have more to speak on that.
Well, some of what I've been thinking about is the times where I am, instead of what kinds of techniques or materials do I learn from Indigenous people on how to repair material culture, what kinds of opportunities can I create for Indigenous people to come and do the treatments on their own material culture? Because there are some things like sewing repair on gut skin with gut and sinew that's more appropriate to be done by a cultural expert because it adds to the biography of the object. And, we all get and know intimately the richness and wellness benefits from working with collections. And I think it's important that we create those opportunities for source communities to have access to the wellness and really powerful be using too if they want to. And I'll give an example of something that might not pan out, but has me thinking in that direction, which is in the Chilkat dye working group, one of the plants that was thought to make a good dye is chocolate lily. And I wasn't sure what part of the plant. It's got a tuber in the bottom, a kind of rice-like tuber that is said to be edible. So I was boiling that in order to try to figure out if it made a dye. And I didn't get a good dye out of it, but it made a paste that seemed very much like a wheat starch paste, a really lovely paste. And I've got that hanging in my window to see if it cross-links, turns colors, reversible, like that sort of thing. And the reason that I'm interested in this paste is because contemporary Chilkat weavers sometimes use adhesive at the ends of their fringe on their robes to stop them from fraying, like crazy glue or stuff from the fabric store that doesn't age very well. So can we as conservators give them ideas for, materials that they might want to use on artifacts? Like how do we make possibilities, options, opportunities, collaborations, that sort of thing.
Thank you, Ellen. I love that idea. I will ask the next question that I saw. I'm just going in the order that they came in. From Jane, she would love to hear more about the mobile conservation lab that you mentioned, Nicole. How do you
Yeah.
something like that?
Yeah, so working mobile in Alaska, as Ellen pointed out in that great slide, just how vast it is. And the sheer logistics alone in making that work was a steep learning curve. Not only starting your own private practice, but then starting your own private practice in a state where it's really difficult to get solvents shipped to places. And then once you maybe get solvents shipped to a city like Juneau or Fairbanks or Anchorage, then you have to then travel to maybe a bush community on a float plane, and then it has to go on a hazmat shipment, which happens once every week or 2 weeks, or in the winter, once every month. So it's just the planning alone is a little bit mind-boggling, but very exciting. You never are really bored. So how I made it work, well, like I said, a lot of planning. I learned to make do, to sort of MacGyver as much as I needed to, utilize local hardware stores often. I always go to the local hardware stores and not the Lowe's or Home Depots, because those are the folks that are going to help you out. And just a lot of planning. So what I would do for, if I'm going remote, I need to make sure I've got not only my equipment, but power supply. So I had to do a whole sort of investigation of solar panels and battery cells and realize the efficacy of those instruments in the field, powering my technology, iPads and cameras. And then backups. Typically I would travel from site to site, whether I'm doing Alaska Air or, a prop plane or a float plane, and have totes with organized materials, all the MSD on hand. Sometimes Alaska Air was very friendly and good, and sometimes they took my supplies. I don't know. So it was really gambling a lot, but if I knew I was going to a site and I knew I needed very specific supplies, I would pre-ship and order and have them sent there if possible. But as I don't know if Ellen mentioned this, or maybe it's always present, but Alaska is very expensive. So shipping things, receiving things, just, whatever you would get in the lower 48, like, times 3 maybe is the cost. So you really just have to sort of keenly plan. And I would have all of those supplies either delivered or I would trek them. As of right now, I still have work sort of happening here and there in Alaska, and I've got little nests of materials squirreled away in Southeast Alaska, in Skagway, in Fairbanks, and in Anchorage. So I have acquired little kits and supplies so that I can access those points when I need to. I don't know if that's helpful.
It is, and it really speaks to Ellen's comment about the nature of relationships and how we get things done. And I'm sure all conservators have experienced this, where you are really relying on the people around you to help support you. So in terms of support and relationships, actually, we've got a great question from Fran Ritchie, and there's been a follow-up from Nancy Ravenel. And so Fran had asked, when you're working with a community for the first time, are there things that you do to prepare yourself to pay the proper cultural respect? If you're able to get in contact with them, research the history of the place, or of course, there's always the golden rule of treat others as you would like to be treated. And building on that, Nancy Ravenel asked, do you have suggestions on protocols for contacting a community for the first time?
A couple thoughts on that. One of them is, I think that one of the most useful things that I've found for doing this kind of work is if you find an individual from the culture, particularly an artist who knows the materials and knows the culture, and you explain what you're trying to do, and then let them decide how you should proceed. Because they will know the right things and follow their orders, give it over to them and let them decide the best way to answer your question, show you how things are done, and to lead that investigation. So I found that to be incredibly fruitful and a huge realm of learning. And then there are, if it's a totally cold situation where you don't have connections necessarily, there are traditional councils or formal entities and organizations that you can contact and get meet folks through that way. And I think that this is where I kind of get into this networks of relationships idea, because if we are constantly cultivating folks that we know, somebody's going to know somebody who knows somebody that hopefully can connect. So that's kind of what's been helpful to me. Nicole?
Yeah, I definitely echo that. I find reaching out to the community center is always a good idea first. And just even, if you don't have a contact, going there first, introducing yourself, clearly stating what the objective is, why you're going to be visiting. I always try to schedule time for a meetup, just not project work, just could we meet and talk, and could we grab a coffee, just some sort of introduction before you just come in and start working. You really want to be respectful. Like I said in my sort of presentation, like you really are going into people's homes and seeing things that are really important to them. And so pay your respects, build that into whatever time you have, in whatever village or community. a more formal, something to consider, like if you want to organize communication and collaboration, there is a formal document, and I know that I've used it. Museum of the North in Fairbanks, they've definitely sort of adhered to it, and it's the guidelines for collaboration. And that, I think in one of my slides for the UAF, I believe I put the SAR logo and then a web link to that. And it's a guideline for collaboration for both museums and tribal entities so that we can make this a fair and equitable relationship. And so that's sort of a formal document that can be accessed that's really valuable.
Thanks, Nicole. Ellen Pearlstein actually put a link to that resource in the chat so people can find it there. So thanks to Ellen also. The next question is from Cheyenne. What are some of the most important soft and hard skills you've found most useful in order to best promote collaboration between yourself and Indigenous communities? Do you feel like what advice would you have for someone who might feel like an introvert?
I'm sorry, can you say that again, Ashley?
This was my add-on question. I'm sorry, I'm taking over Cheyenne's question, but what advice would you have for someone that feels like an introvert that might have concern about how to start a collaboration like this?
I think honesty and transparency. I don't think you have to sort of be a showman to do that. I think being earnest and down to earth and showing that you're passionate about what you're doing, and being very serious about it and very respectful. Those qualities alone, like I know when I get into a group situation, I can be silly and loud and gregarious, and those things are a benefit, right? They can make people feel calm and, at ease, and not everybody can do those things. But what always shines through is your earnestness and your intent to do the right thing. And wanting them to be people to be a part of it. I don't know if that's too vague, but that's how I've sort of, been moderately successful in forming really great relationships in Alaska.
So in that sense of being an introvert, like I feel like I'm an introvert and kind of a socially awkward person, and that I never feel ready enough, prepared enough, and educated enough to reach out. It's always scary. It's always uncomfortable. I'm outside of my comfort zone. But I don't think any of us really grow if we don't get uncomfortable and we don't move out of our comfort zone. And so I think another one of the soft skills that's been useful or something to think about, I'm going to jump to something I just saw in the chat where Ariel O'Connor said, Ellen, you showed the image of the chill cat blanket. You said, this is the blanket I've been working with. And so often I describe treatments that I've been working on. And in the networks that I was showing, I was only showing kind of people, but if you kind of allow that objects can have personhood, animals can have personhood, plants can have personhood, and that we have relationships, the networks of relationships include those as well. Part of the power of working with collections and objects and things is that they are this non-verbal, written academic, part of the literature kind of thing. It's more of an equalizer in terms of we can come together over this artifact that we all love and we're passionate about. And in those situations, I think the less that we talk as conservators and the more that we just shut up and listen to what our collaborators are saying and what the object is telling us, that's when really magical things happen. And I think we have this urge to talk, to say, I get it, I'm a good person, I'm on board with you, I like you, don't you like me? And I think that the more that we can make ourselves shut up and listen, the better it goes. So I'm gonna shut up now.
I remember actually speaking with Ellen Perlstein a long time ago, and one of the things that we discussed was essentially having empathy for the object as well, the story that it told, and being sensitive to that and the nuances of time and that's had its effects on the objects is part of that story. We have so many other questions too, so I'm going to jump right back in. So this one is actually probably more focused for you, Ellen, but Nicole, please share as well, is if you found that, how often are you able to host Indigenous interns, and or in the case of the gut parka, have members of the community with the hand skills executed repairs themselves, and what are the best ways that you have found to to promote the direct involvement in the conservation process, in addition to the more traditional consultation of either maker to conservator or conservator to maker? I paraphrased a bit there.
Right. Well, both in the Chilkat robe example and the Elaine Kingniguk working on the gut parka in Cordova, both of those were treatments that were executed by Indigenous experts who actually did the treatments on the objects. And I think that this is one of those situations where you kind of pick and choose what projects you'll go deep on, because these are time-consuming and elaborate projects, and you need to build in the unknown of what it's going to take for those projects to happen. When Anna came and did the Chilkat robe, she had a whole bunch of other objects that weren't related to the robe and raw materials that she never used that she brought to the lab because they needed to be there with her, and they needed to be there to help establish her authority in ways that I didn't understand to begin with. Or when Elaine Kiniguk was treating the parka, there was storytelling and dance and other educational things that she chose to bring to the event. So you just need to make space for people to do things the way that they need to, that you don't even know about yet. So that's one. Nicole, do you have an example?
Because I was just sort of a one-woman operation, I never really had the opportunity to take on interns, for any of the projects. But I will say I have definitely had, working with Al Starr on the Bear Spear. I mean, that was an incredibly, interactive experience when we both were looking at it, handling. He was helping me clean it a little bit and learning about the tools I was using, and he was telling me about the tools that were used to make the spear. And the treatment itself was relatively simple, but the stories that went along with why we were doing things, and it was actually debated amongst him and his brothers on how the treatment should go. There wasn't a clear option at the beginning, but after talking with them, Al said, I really want to preserve the history. So I said, well, let's just do it. And so we sat there together for, I don't know, it was 2 or 3 days in Denali and worked on it. So I mean, that is what I hope will come of the project. And that's what Angela Lynn, who's the head collections manager of ethnology there, that's what we're hoping, is that sort of side by side, hands-on, collaborative work. That's really the goal for that project. So that might be all I have to say for that question.
Ellen, you mentioned making space for things maybe that you hadn't planned for, and Stacy asked, oh no, I just lost your question. Oh no, I found it. Stacy asked, how much additional time do you factor in for Indigenous community dialogue when you're approaching a new project? And I just also want to mention that Chris is a model maker at the Smithsonian that did some collaborative work on with some Tlingit clan leaders, I think, replica of a hat. And he pointed out the amount of time that was needed. And, it's understandable that it takes time to build relationships with people, but how do you plan for that?
Well, I don't know that this is, possible for everybody, and it's not really the way that, my culture does things. The way I was raised and the way my culture does things is you have your work 9 to 5, and you have your personal life and your home life. And so part of what I do is I mix them up, and I try to keep relationships going on the weekends and evenings, and I don't really try to put an end to when an event or a relationship is going to conclude. And so I think that the idea that you will have a short, intense relationship with a person just for your treatment, just for the purposes of the project is, maybe not the right way to consider these relationships. The Chill Cat Die Working Group, for example, has been going on for a couple of years, and I don't know what the end point is, and I don't know what the end product is going to be. In my mind's eye, there's like maybe a website and maybe there's a publication that we co-author, but I'm not quite sure yet. And until we're through pandemic, I won't be able to talk to these, dozen or 20 people and kind of, build a consensus of like, what do we want this to look like? This information, how do we want to be sharing it? So it's kind of a imprecise answer, but I'm still figuring that out myself.
It's great that you have the ability to maintain those relationships. One of the things we talked about when we were planning this event was I just feel like you're so lucky to be in Alaska, be closer to people that you're working with, although you did say it's such a big state, but it's not as far away as, a different continent. So anyway.
There was one thing
Thank you for that work.
that I just wanted to throw out there that kind of has a little bit to do with a question I saw out there. Oh yeah, the Caitlin Fong, what's been most helpful for creating an open space for cultural experts to share their expertise in potentially intimidating museum settings? Something I want to throw out there that has really only become really obvious to me recently is food. We've got IPM, we have like all these ways food is not allowed in the museum. You don't bring food in the lab, you don't eat at your desk, like food and museum artifacts don't go together. But food and making people comfortable and making people feel appreciated is a big deal. And native food is amazing. Like the best eating I've done in my life has been native foods. And a lot of the things that are made from the plants and animals that that turn into artifacts, a lot of that stuff isn't gathered in the first place to make artifacts. It's gathered for food. And then they're not being wasteful and they're using the entire animal, for example. So I think having a pot of coffee on, having some smoked salmon, having some chocolate, and sitting down and chatting over sharing food has been a big change in my practice.
It's completely speaking to the restaurant part of my heart. So I'm gonna hop up there. So Linda, speaking of IPM, Linda Landry had asked if there are if pesticide residues on collections are ever an issue in your work, and if so, how does that affect your approach to collaborations? Because we know that XRF is great, but when you have an issue of power for backcountry conservation, you can't always power that, and you might not have that resource at hand. So please do take that away.
Sure, and I've been there, and I know that world. And what we do continually is just practice good handling protocol. If we are in a site where there is no way that I could, bring an XRF, although Ellen has lent me the XRF a few times, but it's just not possible in some of the places you go. And so what I like to implement is just education. And provide materials. I'll bring a couple boxes of nitrile gloves and leave them and say, if we're not sure about these things, let's wait on it until maybe we can get some arsenic test kits or whatever. But let's and I just talk to them about the presence of these materials and why it's good to exercise caution when handling. So that's really what I've done in the past until I could get access to analytical instrumentation or test kits.
Here's a tough question from Dan. As a conservator, where do you place yourself in a treatment outcome discussion where the desires of two opposing stakeholders are at odds, such as museum administrators, like your bosses, and the originating community?
Yeah, well, this is one of those where our museum or our AIC ethics of retreatability or reversibility are helpful. Like not doing something that you can't undo is kind of a good thing. And I think that bringing this up is this reminder: the more that you work with communities, the more you realize that they're not these monolithic entities. That in any given community, there's different opinions about how to do things and different agendas, and people are figuring out who has the authority to do what. And so sometimes when you're talking to a community, you don't get, or most of the time you don't get total consensus. And in our museum, there's often, hierarchies and agendas and people that don't necessarily agree and whatnot. And so I think that's part of navigating networks of human psychology and human beings. And I guess one of the things that we think about here that I talk about often with my boss is, if we're going to look back on what we're doing today, and we're going to look back in 5 years, like are we going to be proud of ourselves? What are we going to be able to say, and feel like we had integrity and did our best? So that's kind of where some of those discussions go.
Yeah, and to sort of speak to that topic, I've found myself in situations where going into a project knowing that it was maybe going to be a complicated answer. And so that goes back to that one slide I showed that had Alstar with the spear, and then there was also a box drum that I just forgot to sort of mention and talk about. But it's about transparency and providing options and time to look over and review those options. Because what I did with information for Ron, which was the Dakdetan elder, with the box drum that was repatriated to the Huna clan, is I gave them a whole set of documentation about, I was a graph and grids and tables saying, okay, so here's what we can do. Minimal to heavy intervention, materials lined out, pros and cons, what these materials are. I'm not going to throw out methylcellulose and, I'm going to say this is, describe what it is and what are the pros and cons of using these materials. And I gave all of that information to them. And then 8 months later, they had talked about it, we had made a decision, and then maybe 2 months after that, that's when the actual treatment happened. So I think time and space, giving people, when you're not right there waiting, or it's a personal conversation that has to happen maybe when you're not around. And that's what happened. I gave Ron that literature, and he took it to the elders of Huna, and they sat on it and looked at it for a while, and then they all came to a consensus, voted on how the treatment should proceed in terms of level of intervention. And then everybody was on board from that point on, but it took discussion time.
And I think we're just 2 minutes away from the end of our program, but I'd love to take these last two questions and wrap them together. Are you both able to do any oral history as part of your conservation treatments with communities? And are there ways that you document those treatments performed by and with Indigenous artists?
The only oral histories, I'm sorry, Ellen, I didn't mean to interrupt you. It is like, when I was talking with Al about the spear, and he was telling me about the history of it. All of that I've recorded, not audio, but in, when I'm doing reports and talking with him, and then obviously with permission, always with permission to include that in a document. So if there is information that I find out during a treatment, like when the box drum, talking with folks about it, and they were like, oh, well, this one area is really fatigued in the corner because that's how you play it. You get the drum, you get the box, and you roll it back and you play it. And so this area, these localized areas of fatigue, I was just like, oh, there's fatigue there. And they're like, oh, that's from playing. So, that information, I always, just insert into the document if I can.
I'm going to take a chance to answer this in a little bit of a different angle that maybe addresses a slightly different question I saw in the chat as well. And that is how documentation happens for these treatments. And two examples I want to quick share. One of them was a Haida canoe that is on exhibit here that Steve Brown, who's a really renowned non-native carver, but longtime collaborator with a lot of communities. He came and repaired this canoe, but because we had all this other stuff going on to put in a new museum, Lyanna Wallace, whose photo I showed, she kind of got the dye project going. She was on staff and I said, Lyanna, I'm supposed to be, dealing with these interns. Could you kind of be Steve's handler and, capture what he's doing, take pictures, make notes. And then after you're done taking notes, I'll just cut and paste that and do a treatment report, right? And the notes that she gave me afterwards, the things she decided were important to capture were not what we usually capture as conservators. And so I didn't end up cutting and pasting her report. I ended up leaving it the way that she did it and designed it because it was her capturing of what she thought was important of that process. As an expert who had, been on grew up on a fishing boat and, knew a lot about watercraft and that sort of thing. So that's one example. And then another example is I just kind of want to make a plug for how important language is to the people that we collaborate with. Indigenous languages are a huge, super important big deal that is kind of lost on us a little bit. And there was a while back I was working with Paige Schmidt, who's now at the Mariners Museum, and she was repairing a model boat, an Anyak, and Sven Hawkinson helped kind of help us figure out what the parts of it were. And I asked Paige, hey, when you do this report, could you have diagrams and can you refer to the parts of the Anyak, this skin boat, can you refer to these in the native language? And so she wrote the treatment report with all these native words in it. And I'm still processing like how that works, because now when I read that report, I keep going back and forth and it's hard to understand what she did where without a lot of going back and forth to the diagram. And so should there have been more, this was the mast and this was the thwart in the report. So I think that that's something for us to think about too, is how we incorporate Indigenous language into the report writing that we do.
Well, I think that might be all the time we have for tonight. I don't know if you want to jump in, Gwen, but I just want to say thank you to Ellen and Nicole so much for sharing your work. I felt really inspired by it. So thank you so much for sharing. And I think you can see in the comments
Indeed.
a lot of people. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Our next WCG meeting will be in March with the intern talks, which is always a popular meeting. So keep an eye out for that invite.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. Great questions from our audience. Thank you again. And thank you, Ellen and Nicole.
Round of applause.
Thank you.
Bye.